October 1962, high in the upper layers of the atmosphere over the Caribbean, inside the narrow cockpit of a Lockheed U-2, an American pilot wears a pressure suit that makes him look more like an astronaut than an aviator. Far below, the world feels distant, small, incapable of reaching that long-winged machine slicing through the sky at over 20 kilometers in altitude. To the United States, this aircraft was not merely a surveillance platform, it was a pure symbol of technological supremacy. A machine so advanced that, for years, it had flown over enemy territory with total impunity. Washington believed it was looking down on the world, both literally and strategically. The message was unmistakable. We see everything, and you cannot touch us. On the other side of the chessboard, inside Soviet command centers and anti-aircraft batteries scattered across Cuba, the emotion was different. Not fear, but defiance. To many Soviet officers, the U-2 embodied American arrogance, condensed into lightweight metal and impossibly long wings. A fragile aircraft, slow, dependent on the assumption that no one would dare to respond. They knew the numbers, they understood the theoretical limits, and they believed this American confidence was excessive. After all, no machine was invincible. The problem was not the airplane itself. The problem was what it represented, an enemy that believed it had already won before the war had even begun. While American leaders trusted charts, altitude envelopes, and probabilities calculated in air-conditioned rooms, there was a quiet conviction that the conflict was under control. The Cold War was seen as a rational game, almost mathematical. Each side understood its limits, its red lines, its unspoken rules. The U-2 was living proof of that logic. It flew because it could, because the other side knew that responding would be too dangerous. To the United States, this was not provocation. It was routine. A world observed from above, tamed by technology, stabilized by superiority. But in that seemingly calm sky, something fundamental was being miscalculated. American pride swelled silently, sustained by the belief that modern war had become predictable, controllable, almost elegant. On the other side, watchful eyes observed not with panic, but with cold patience. They did not see a god in the sky. They saw a moving mistake, and without anyone realizing it, the world was drifting dangerously close to a point where a single shot, fast, localized, seemingly insignificant, could shatter every certainty and push humanity to the edge of a nuclear abyss. Before that moment, the world of war followed rules that felt almost permanent. The Cold War was dangerous, yes, but it was also structured, calculated, and governed by doctrines that both sides believed they understood perfectly. Power was measured in numbers. How many bombers, how many missiles, how many divisions could be mobilized in a matter of hours? Deterrence was mathematical. Stability came not from trust, but from symmetry. Each side knew exactly how far it could push without triggering catastrophe, and that knowledge created a strange sense of comfort. The system was brutal, but it was familiar. At the center of this model was the belief in rational actors and clear thresholds. Nuclear weapons were the ultimate boundary, the final line no one would cross lightly. Everything below that level was manageable. Reconnaissance flights, naval patrols, exercises, even confrontations by proxy, all of it fit neatly into a framework where escalation was controlled and intentions were assumed to be readable. Intelligence gathering, especially from the air, was considered a stabilizing force. Seeing the enemy reduced uncertainty. Knowing their capabilities prevented panic. In that logic, aircraft like the U-2 were not provocations. They were safety valves, tools that kept the balance intact by ensuring there were no surprises. The United States trusted altitude, speed, and technological margins. The Soviet Union trusted layered defenses, command discipline, and political restraint. Both sides believed they were playing the same game, reading from the same rulebook. Missiles were counted, response times calculated, retaliation scenarios rehearsed endlessly. War, if it ever came, would be loud, obvious, and unmistakable. It would begin with decisions made at the highest levels, not with accidents, misunderstandings, or a single radar track on a screen. Within this old game, the world felt tense but stable, a controlled confrontation where logic ruled and catastrophe, though terrifying, remained distant and theoretical. What almost no one wanted to admit was that this entire structure rested on a single fragile assumption: that every actor involved would always behave rationally, calmly, and with perfect information. The Cold War order depended on the belief that men, under extreme pressure, would think like equations, that they would interpret signals correctly, follow doctrine precisely, and pause long enough to confirm intentions before acting. It assumed that technology would clarify reality, not distort it. As long as this assumption held, the system appeared solid, even elegant. It had worked before. It had worked yesterday. There was no reason, on the surface, to believe it would fail tomorrow. This confidence was reinforced by routine. Reconnaissance flights happened regularly. Alerts were raised and stood down without incident. Radar contacts appeared and disappeared. Submarines shadowed fleets, and fleets pretended not to notice. Each time nothing happened, the belief in the system grew stronger. Every uneventful day was treated as proof that the model was correct. The absence of disaster was interpreted as success, not luck. Over time, caution slowly transformed into complacency, and safeguards designed for rare emergencies became background noise in a machine that never seemed to break. Beneath this calm, however, the system was growing more brittle. Decisions were increasingly compressed into minutes. Information traveled faster than human judgment could comfortably process. Complex chains of command depended on flawless communication, while operating in environments defined by stress, secrecy, and fear. Yet none of this was seen as a threat. After all, no one intended to start a war. No one planned to make a mistake. The old game had no space for accidents with strategic consequences. It assumed that control was permanent, that the machinery of deterrence, once built, would run forever simply because it always had. The first crack in the system did not appear as a grand breakthrough or a dramatic shift in doctrine. It emerged quietly, almost invisibly, from the margins of the Cold War machine. High-altitude reconnaissance aircraft like the U-2 were never designed to change the nature of warfare or destabilize global strategy. They were conceived as a practical answer to a narrow technical problem: how to see beyond closed borders without starting a war. Satellites were still unreliable, slow to deploy, and limited in resolution. Human intelligence was scarce and compromised. The solution was not revolutionary in intent. It was simply efficient. Fly higher than any interceptor, gather information, return home. A tool, not a weapon. At first, this innovation was treated as an accessory to the existing system, not a challenge to it. The flights were framed as routine, almost administrative. They did not alter battle plans or force new doctrines. They existed to support the old game, not replace it. In Washington, the U-2 was discussed in technical terms: altitude ceilings, fuel endurance, camera resolution. In Moscow, it was dismissed as an irritation, a temporary advantage that would eventually be neutralized. No one saw it as a destabilizing force. It was assumed that once countermeasures caught up, the balance would quietly restore itself. What made this innovation dangerous was not its power, but how little attention it received at the strategic level. Because it was born as a workaround, not a declaration, it bypassed the political alarms that usually accompanied major military changes. It slipped into the system without forcing anyone to rethink the rules. Yet, by operating in the thin space between peace and war, between surveillance and violation, it began to stretch the old assumptions in ways no one was measuring. It solved a local problem beautifully, and in doing so, planted the seed for a failure the system was never designed to absorb. The moment the system was truly tested did not arrive with a declaration of war or a sweeping military operation. It came suddenly, in isolation, and far from the centers of power that believed they were in control. A single flight, a single radar contact, a situation that by old standards should have remained manageable. When the U-2 was tracked and then brought down, the act itself was militarily minor. One aircraft, one pilot, one point on a map. Yet the consequences rippled outward with a force no doctrine had prepared for. To those operating within the established framework, the event was deeply unsettling. The aircraft had not attacked anything, it had not fired a weapon, and yet its destruction produced political shockwaves far greater than the loss of a bomber or a ship ever would have. The old logic struggled to keep up. Was this an act of defense or an act of aggression? A tactical response or a strategic provocation? The system had no clean category for what had just occurred. The rules assumed that combat actions and political escalation moved together. Here, they didn't. What made the shock even more dangerous was how contained it appeared. There was no battlefield collapse, no visible chaos, no immediate retaliation. On the surface, everything remained quiet. But beneath that calm, decision-makers on both sides were forced to interpret an event that didn't fit their models. The innovation had been used exactly as intended: to observe, to inform, yet its interaction with reality produced an effect wildly disproportionate to its scale. A local incident had suddenly exposed a global vulnerability, and the old patterns offered no clear explanation for what came next. In the days and weeks that followed, the incident refused to fade into the background as a one-off anomaly. Reports stacked up on desks, intelligence summaries grew longer, and internal assessments became more urgent in tone. Radar logs were re-examined. Missile tracking data was compared against flight paths. Communications transcripts were read and reread. Each individual piece of information seemed explainable on its own, but together they formed a pattern that was impossible to dismiss. The system had not merely reacted, it had behaved unpredictably under pressure. What disturbed analysts most was not the success of the interception itself, but the cascade of consequences it triggered. Timelines showed how quickly routine monitoring had transformed into a crisis requiring direct political intervention. Decision windows, once measured in hours or days, had collapsed into minutes. Automated alerts had escalated situations faster than human judgment could comfortably follow. The data revealed a dangerous compression of cause and effect. Small actions were now producing strategic-level reactions, and no one could confidently map where the next escalation point would be. As more simulations were run and historical parallels were searched for, a grim realization began to take hold. This was no longer about a single aircraft or a single command decision. The numbers suggested something structural. The same conditions that produced this incident existed elsewhere, in other airspaces, on other patrol routes, inside submarines and missile silos operating under similar assumptions. What had once been explained away as misfortune now looked like an early warning. The anomaly had repeated itself often enough, across enough systems, to reveal a pattern the old game was never designed to survive. The first responses were instinctive and conservative. Procedures were revised, altitude limits were adjusted, new authorization layers were added, new codes introduced, new checklists printed and distributed. On paper, it looked like progress. The system was doing what it had always done when confronted with uncertainty, tightening control, adding safeguards, reinforcing discipline. Each fix assumed that the core logic was sound and that the problem lay in execution. If everyone followed the rules more carefully, the balance would hold. But reality refused to cooperate. Every adjustment created new points of friction. Additional authorization slowed responses without reducing risk. Tighter engagement rules increased hesitation at lower levels while increasing pressure at the top. Commanders were asked to make faster decisions with more consequences and less clarity. Technology continued to deliver data at a relentless pace, but meaning lagged behind. The system was optimized for a world where signals were clear and escalation was linear. That world no longer existed. What became increasingly clear was that no technical patch could resolve the contradiction at the heart of the model. The problem was not faulty equipment or poorly trained personnel. It was the assumption that control could be maintained in an environment where speed, ambiguity, and automation dominated. Each failed adaptation stripped away another layer of confidence. The old logic was being stretched beyond its limits, and with every attempt to preserve it, the system revealed just how close it was to breaking under its own weight. Slowly, and with deep resistance, the truth became impossible to avoid. What had emerged was not a flaw to be corrected or a capability to be countered with symmetrical measures. It was a shift in the very nature of strategic stability. The combination of high-altitude surveillance, rapid decision cycles, and automated escalation had created a new environment where control was no longer absolute. The balance of power was no longer defined solely by arsenals and doctrines, but by who could perceive, interpret, and react to reality faster and with fewer mistakes than the other. This realization was deeply unsettling because it undermined decades of certainty. The old model assumed that power resided in restraint, in the ability to absorb information without overreacting. The new paradigm rewarded speed, integration, and information dominance, even if that speed increased the risk of catastrophic error. Deterrence no longer rested only on fear of retaliation, but on the ability to manage complexity under extreme pressure. In this world, a single misinterpretation could trigger consequences far beyond anyone's intent. The equilibrium had shifted quietly, without a formal announcement or decisive battle, yet it was irreversible. The system that once promised stability through predictability had been replaced by one where invisibility, uncertainty, and rapid escalation defined the battlefield. The Cold War did not suddenly become more violent, it became more fragile, and in that fragility, both sides were forced to confront a new reality. The greatest threat was no longer deliberate aggression, but the inability to control the forces they themselves had unleashed. What ultimately emerged from this near disaster was not a victory measured in territory taken or enemies defeated, but something far more profound. The incident did not win a battle because there was no battle to win. Instead, it rendered an entire way of thinking obsolete. The old model, built on rigid doctrines, predictable escalation, and the comforting belief that control could always be maintained, could no longer explain the world as it truly was. A system designed to prevent catastrophe had revealed how easily it could create one. From that point forward, the Cold War was no longer just a contest of strength. It became a contest of perception, restraint, and systems management. Leaders began to understand that survival depended not only on deterrence, but on avoiding situations where deterrence could fail by accident. Communication hotlines were established. Protocols for crisis management were rewritten. Red lines became more carefully defined, not to enable confrontation, but to prevent misunderstanding. The goal was no longer to dominate every moment, but to reduce the chances that a single moment could end everything. In this sense, the conflict ended without ever fully erupting. Not because the weapons disappeared, but because the illusion of control was shattered just enough to inspire caution. The world stepped back from the edge, aware now that the greatest danger was not an enemy's intent, but the fragile systems built to contain it. War, from that moment on, was no longer just about power. It was about responsibility, and the quiet, permanent understanding that some games once played long enough can end the world simply by continuing.